Hi, everybody. Welcome to this short session on the 5 Conversations Framework. Tim Baker's my name. I just want to take you through a process that I think you might find very useful. You may want to use this as a replacement for the performance review, or you could use it as an enabler to improve the interactions that happen in a performance review. Now, either way works extremely well, but I did want to share it with you because we've had some great success with this program, and we've had this cross-culturally. So, there are countries all over the world that are using this sort of process, or at least organizations using this, both in the private sector, public sector, and not-for-profit. So I'll share it with you and give you a sense of how it works. And so let me share my screen to start with, and then we'll launch into the presentation. So just a little bit about me. If you're not aware who I am, I'm a keynote speaker. I run workshops. I'm a postgraduate lecturer. I also write books, and I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brizzy. So there's a few key things about me there that I won't bore you with too much, but let's just launch into maybe an objection that you might be thinking, because there are plenty of these conversation frameworks out there. So I guess the question is, why is this better than other conversation frameworks? Now, I think there's been a proliferation of these frameworks because I think people are starting to realize, hopefully, that leadership is a relationship, and it's really a relationship that's developed through a series of conversations with their team members. And I know many leaders have check-ins with people, and I think it's a very good idea to do that, by the way, but often they run out of things to talk about. So I'm hoping that this might give you a sense of maybe what are some of the themes that you might cover in your check-ins with your team members. But I strongly recommend that you continue to do that. And we're all busy people, but I can assure you that if you have these regular check-ins with your people, you'll find that you'll get a tremendous buy-in. You'll lift your trust, account, if I could put it that way, and there'll be a lot of good things that'll come out of it, including engagement. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover this morning in our brief session together. Obviously, I'll talk about the 5 conversations. What are these 5 conversations? And basically a couple of questions around them that might help you. I'll talk about a process. So if you're actually trying to implement this in your own working environment, what would you do? How would you go about it? And when I say implement it, I mean, you can do that as an individual leader, of course, but if you perhaps wanted to implement it across the board in the organization overall, what would you need to do? And I've got a special offer for you, because this work comes from my book, The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential. So I do cover this in the book. So I'll give you, very much the bare bones of it today. I'll be sending you a copy of the slides and the recording, of course, at the end of this presentation, as well as I normally do. So what you're seeing in front of you now is the 5 Conversations framework. And essentially, you'll notice on the left-hand side, there are 5 months. So the suggestion is that you have a conversation with each of your team members once a month for 5 months. Now, the questions are designed in such a way that you would have a 20 to, at the most, 30-minute catch up with each of your team members once a month. Now, you could go longer if you want, but I don't necessarily think that's true. And I think often people think that if I don't have an extended conversation, it's not a worthy conversation, but I don't necessarily think that's the case. It's all about the questions that you ask and the subjects you broach. So I think really, if you confine it to 20 to 30 minutes, it's very manageable once a month. And of course, this whole process is designed to do that. So and then of course, in the middle column, you can see the actual theme. And over on the right-hand side, you can see the actual content that's related to that theme. And what I'll do is I'll talk about that as well and give you a sense of how it works. Now, the whole process has been designed to cover a lot of topics that you would probably want to cover in a performance review, but you wouldn't get necessarily around to doing it because there's so much to do in a performance review. And that's one of my criticisms of the performance review. It does too much. The performance review is really an appraisal, and to start having developmental conversations during the performance review is not necessarily practical because you've got so many things to cover. So instead of doing it all in 1 hour or an hour and a half, whatever time you put aside, my suggestion is you do this on a regular basis, once a month. Now, the first conversation is a climate review conversation, has nothing to do with the weather, of course, but everything to do with people's morale, job satisfaction, and basic communication within the team. Companies spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on engagement surveys that they roll out once a year. And what we find, certainly from my experience, is what we're finding is that there are less and less people contributing to these regular engagement surveys online. And I think the reason for that is fairly obvious, and that is that people probably don't think it's worthwhile. In other words, if I spend, say, 30 minutes devoted to this, will anything change? Or, will we even get the results? This is a typical sort of concern that employees have in organizations, and I think it's a fair concern. My question is, why don't we just talk about it in conversation format across the organization? Why do we need to sort of have this online process? Some people might say, well, people may not be honest face to face, but they might be online. But therein lies a pretty important issue. Why aren't people willing to be honest with you during a conversation? And the fact that they may not feel, or they might feel guarded by sharing their own opinion, would probably suggest that the conversation is extremely important. So, I think you can get just as much out of it, in fact, more, by having the conversation. But the climate review conversation starts with a very simple question. And that is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? So that's the first question. Now, the person might respond by saying 6. And then your next question around that is why 6? So it opens up a dialogue, it opens up a conversation about why they've rated it as 6. In other words, you could find out and get some insight on what's important to them. What do they think is important? And then you can move into how perhaps that satisfaction can be improved. We all know that job satisfaction ebbs and flows. So it could be up one day, down the next, but the bottom line is you're getting a handle on it at that conversation point. And so this is important because you connect with your team member where they're at that stage. And it's a very pleasant conversation. It's a very easy conversation. It gives you some good feedback about where people are at in terms of their general well-being at the time. So it's a great place to start. And then when you get into conversation 2, which is, the strengths and talents conversation, this is starting where people are who have natural innate talents. So instead of starting with what people aren't doing well, how about we start with what people are doing well? And you might say, well, why would we do that? And the reason is that we want to capitalize on people's strengths and innate talents. So instead of asking people at the start of conversation 2, what is your strengths, which probably you'll get a blank look if you ask that question. A better question would be, what do you enjoy most about the work you do? Because there's a high correlation, we know in the research, between what people enjoy and what people are good at. So by asking that question, you are essentially unearthing something that people are probably good at. So they might say, for example, I really enjoy the client interaction, or I enjoy project work, or whatever it might be that they say. That gets the ball rolling. And then the line of questioning then is around how you can better harness and utilize that strength in future working assignments and projects. So this is based, of course, on positive psychology and the idea that we can build on strengths as much as we can build on, areas and opportunities for growth. So it's an uplifting conversation. It creates an upward spiral of positivity, and I think that's really important. So once you've done conversation 2, as we move into conversation 3, it's really about the opportunities for growth, which is probably the more closely aligned to the traditional performance review. Again, for all of these conversations, you give people the questions so that when they come to your regular catch-up, they're actually prepared and they're willing to share. So that's really important. So it's not about you sitting there in conversation 3 on opportunities for growth and actually giving people, the benefit of your wisdom in terms of, what they're doing wrong. Ask them what they see as their opportunity for growth over the next 6 to 12 months. And then, of course, you can talk further about that and in terms of how that can be implemented and how you as a leader can support them in that endeavor. So if you look at conversation 2, strengths and talents, and conversation 3, which is opportunities for growth, you can see that in conversation 4, we bring all this together. So conversation 4 is learning and development. And this is all about how do we harness your strengths and build on them, and how do we minimize and improve some of the areas of growth that you mentioned in conversation 3. So it's really I suppose, organizations do a training needs analysis, and this is a normal process where HR will sort of survey the organization and look for all the learning and development opportunities that may exist in the workplace. But again, instead of doing this that way, why not just have the conversation about it? So you as the leader are well aware of how you can support people. The other thing that's important here is it's not always about sending people off to training courses. It might be about mentoring. It might be about buddying somebody up with somebody else. It might be about showing people how something might work. So there's a lot of learning that's very informal on the job that is extremely valuable and highly underrated in terms of people's own progress and development in organizations. So whereas conversation 4 is about the individual and their own growth and development, conversation 5 is really about the organization or the working environment. And that is the innovation and continuous improvement conversation is about how we can make our workplace more efficient and effective. So what I'm again asking people to do is to come to that conversation with some ideas about how we can improve our working environment. So it could be anything from a system to a safety issue. It could be just a whiteboard, that needs to be put up on a wall. There's a whole myriad of things that it could raise. And some of the things that people raise with you in conversation 5 are probably not necessarily practical, or they might be time consuming or costly. And that's fair enough. But I guarantee that if you're doing this conversation, imagine doing this across the whole organization, irrespective of the size of your organization, it's highly likely that it will unearth some really great ideas. And of course, if those ideas come out of the conversation and they're implemented, then people might be a little more forthcoming in the future about their own ways of suggestions for improvements. So you can see that we've covered a broad range of different topics in the 5 conversations framework. You might say, well, what happens after month 5? Well, what happens after month 5 is you might have a month or 2, and then you get back into it again. So ideally, and I've seen this work extremely well, if you have 10 conversations a year, that is 2 rounds of the 5 conversations, you'll find that is extremely beneficial, not only for the person on the receiving end, but also for you and the organization. You just imagine this for a moment, depending on the size of your organization. If everybody in your organization was willing to have 10, 20-minute developmental and performance conversations with their team members, just imagine what that would mean in terms of building trust, improving engagement, increasing morale. It would make a massive difference, and it has in those places where I've implemented this. So there it is in a nutshell. I can certainly let you know, I can steer you in the direction of where the questions are, but I just wanted to share with you how you might implement this in your own organization and what you might do if you were looking at doing this. And of course, I'd be more than happy to support you in this endeavor. So you can see that there are 6 steps involved. And I found when I wrote the book initially and I implemented this, introduced the 5 conversations, one of the things that I underestimated was how quickly busyness could get in the way and disrupt the 5 conversations framework. So let me talk about how you might minimize that, because I think it's extremely important. It's not, if you sell it right, it'll be an easy sale in terms of, people understanding what you're doing. So that won't be difficult. What will be difficult is making sure that it's a mainstay in the regular activities of your workplace. That's the key. So let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. So the first step in the process is to assess your workplace. Now, what are we doing here? I've got a 50 statement online survey that I administer. And what that does is get a snapshot of how the culture is before you start. Now, why do I want to do that? Because if we can get a sort of a baseline of where people are at around engagement and trust and so forth, we can then start the 5 conversations framework and then assess at the end, and that will give some very tangible evidence of how effective this process is. So I'd urge you to think about that as well, because it is useful, because if you can see that there are very obvious benefits, then of course you will continue with it because you can see the value in it. So that's step 1. Step 2 is it's a good idea to induct any leader in the workplace on the 5 conversations framework. Now, and in fact, I would suggest to you it's worthwhile inducting those people who'd be on the receiving end. And of course, some people will be on the receiving end, and some people will also be, administering that as well. The induction process isn't terribly complicated. It can be done online, it can be done face-to-face, but it probably, 2 hours would do it. So in that induction, we look at the 5 conversations framework. We look at some of the tips on how to implement it. We look at the questions. We consider why it's important to do this. What are the benefits in it? We also share with people the assessment that comes out from the first round. All right, so that gives us a clear picture of where people are at right now. Of course, that's anonymous, no names attached to it or whatever. It's done on a 360-degree feedback model, so top management, middle management, workforce. So we go through an induction. I think that's important. Otherwise, people misunderstand what we're trying to do. And then one of the most effective things that come out of the process is that, and this depends, of course, on the size of the organization, but I will get 3 or 4 managers together at different points throughout the 5 conversations, and I get them to share their own experiences of the 5 conversations, and they can share their tips and hints with each other. So people actually learn from each other. It's peer group learning. And my job is to facilitate a learning environment. So in a safe environment with 3 or 4 managers, they will talk about what's working, what's not working. They'll pick up tips and hints and all sorts of things like that. And then I also like to use webinars to bookend each month. So for example, if you were starting the 5 conversations framework in November, then the very first webinar would be on conversation 1, which is climate review. And that would be a 30-minute broadcast. And all that does is it gives people an opportunity to understand what the questions are and some of the tips and hints to make the conversation more effective. And there's one of those at the end of each month, so 5 of those, and that gives the people an opportunity to think about how they'll implement it. So then there's the implementation, of course, which is the real learning. And people often say to me, well, you know, I need a day-long workshop on how to have conversations with people. I just think that doing this is the learning itself. So just, you know, we can throw people into the deep end. It's not that deep really, because you've got 3 or 4 questions to ask. You just simply have to have a conversation with someone. It's not difficult. And I think in the induction, we do a little bit of training around how people can actually do that. Now, the other thing that I've implemented, and some organizations take advantage of it, is I have an online web-based management support system, which basically gives people an opportunity to record their answers. So the employee who is on the receiving end has the questions there in their portal. They go through and answer those the way, you know, so they're prepared, and they send they can send an automated message to their manager saying they're ready for the 5 conversations. The manager can then have the conversation, and after they do that, they can be prompted to go into this portal, and they can put their own particular responses to these questions in there as well. So that's quite a useful strategy if you really feel that you need to have a record of what's going on. It works perfectly well without it, but I find that some organizations, they benefit from that. So the point is, I'm not trying to suggest to you that you need to do all of these things, although, you know, if you're doing it thoroughly, you probably should. But my point is that all of those support tools are available to you if you were trying to roll out the 5 conversations across the organization. If you're just using it yourself as a normal, check-in process, fine, no problem at all. But I think, you know, if you're looking at, you know, rolling it out organizationally, I would probably suggest you look at it as a program and of work, and how I could probably support you in that regard. So that's pretty much how it works. And if you've got any questions, of course, send me an email, or, if you want further information, send me an email as well. I'm happy to talk to you further about it. And if you're interested in implementing it, by all means, get in touch with me, because different organizations will have different emphases. The 5 conversations framework itself doesn't change much, but perhaps how it's implemented might be critical to the success of your organization. So that's it from me. I just wanted to mention that next week, each Friday, some of you would be aware of this, that every Friday I have a short, sharp session, always at this time. And next Friday, on the 14th of October, I've got another webinar on the big HR changes for the future, and I wanted to cover those. There are 13 that I've identified in my book, The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential. I want to go through and give you a thumbnail sketch of what they are, and you might then like to assess your organization and think to yourself, well, how closely are we aligned to these new trends or movements? Some organizations are well and truly on track, others aren't, but it's always good to be able to assess your own organization against these 13 different trends. And if you're interested, all you've got to do, of course, is when I send you the email, just click on that link like you did for today, and you'll be registered, and away you go. So that's what's happening next week. And finally, I did say there was a special offer. If you go in and have a look, you'll find that my book is available on Amazon. The prices often fluctuate on Amazon, but if you send me an email today by the close of business, I'm happy to give you the book virtually at half price, $27 plus postage. All you've got to do is send me an email, and I'll be happy to provide you with that. So, if that's something of interest, let me know. Happy to do that. So let me just stop for a moment and just wrap up what I'm doing here. So I'll just turn that off. Okay. So I've had a lot of success with the 5 conversations framework. And as I said, you know, one thing is you could use it as a, you know, if your performance review isn't working, and it wouldn't surprise me, and I'm very skeptical of performance reviews for a range of reasons, which I won't go into now. But if it's not working, then perhaps you might look at this ongoing developmental conversation program over the course of a year. I think you'll get much better results. So that's one thing. But secondly, if you're thinking to yourself, well, our organization would never, ever get rid of the performance review. Okay, fine. This would actually provide a really good enabler so that by the time you get to your performance review, a lot of the things that have been discussed have been discussed. And so it's really not a difficult process to go through. So that's great. Now, the other thing is, of course, you can just use this as an individual to spruce up and improve your normal, regular meetings with your team members. It gives you some great themes to work with. But of course, you can also use it organizationally as well. And if you're interested in, you know, doing that organizationally, just contact me and I'm happy to give you some tips and hints, and perhaps even give you a pricing on how those things might be implemented. They're very cost effective. So folks, that's it from me. Thank you for spending 30 minutes with me on a Friday, and I hope you've got something useful out of today. And I really wish you a really restful weekend. And you know where to find me. So if you need to contact me, just do so, and I'll be happy to have a conversation with you about this. Thanks, everyone. All the best, and we'll catch you next Friday, hopefully. Thank you and goodbye.